Harold Voss didn't even glance at her. He picked up Evelyn Cross's $34,000 check between two fingers, let out a short, dry laugh, and held his lighter to the corner. The paper curled, blackened, and fell into his wastebasket. "We don't cash fantasy checks here, sweetheart," he said, already turning away. What he didn't know, what his entire branch didn't know, was that Evelyn Cross had spent 27 years as a senior field examiner for the Office of the Controller of the Currency. She had personally ordered the closure of 6 regional banks, and the direct line she dialed from her old sedan in the parking lot connected her to the Federal Enforcement Division before the melted check had even cooled. Evelyn Cross wasn't just another customer. She had spent 27 years as one of the most feared federal bank examiners in the country, the kind of auditor who walked into a branch and walked out with the keys. Harold Voss saw a black woman with a check he didn't believe was real. He didn't see the one person in that lobby who could dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. And what she was about to uncover went far beyond one burned piece of paper. Evelyn Cross had walked into First Mutual Savings on the third Friday of every month for 18 years. Same teller window, same polite nod to the security guard, same neat deposit slip filled out in the careful handwriting of a woman who had spent a career examining documents for inconsistencies the rest of the world missed. The check she carried that Friday was for $34,000, a life insurance payout after her husband's passing. Marcus Cross had been a high school history teacher for 31 years. He had died 6 weeks earlier from a heart attack at the kitchen table while grading papers. The insurance check had arrived in a plain white envelope the morning before, and Evelyn had set it on the counter and looked at it for a long time before she picked up her purse. Harold Voss had been the branch manager at First Mutual Savings for 11 years. He was 52 years old, drove a leased Mercedes to a building where most of his customers took the bus, and had built a quiet reputation for making problems disappear. Deposits that went missing, loan applications that got mysteriously denied for certain zip codes, complaints that never made it past his desk. What almost nobody in that branch knew, what only a handful of his most trusted associates understood, was that Harold Voss had been skimming from dormant accounts for nearly a decade. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, moved through a web of 17 accounts he had personally approved and personally managed. Over 10 years, those small amounts had added up to just under $2 million. Every single one of those accounts had belonged to elderly depositors, customers who didn't check their statements closely, customers the bank assumed wouldn't notice. He had never been caught because no one with the right combination of expertise and authority had ever looked closely enough. But here's the thing about Evelyn Cross. Before she retired to care for Marcus during his final years, she had spent 27 years as a senior field examiner for the Office of the Controller of the Currency, the federal agency that regulates and supervises national banks. She had walked into branches from Charlotte to Phoenix with a badge and a forensic accounting kit, and the quiet authority of someone who could freeze assets with a single signature. She had personally ordered the closure of 6 regional banks for fraud and mismanagement. She had trained 37 examiners. She had written the field manual sections on detecting embezzlement through pattern analysis of small account activity. When she walked into your bank, you didn't know she was there until the vault was sealed and your records were on a federal truck heading to Washington. In the parking lot of First Mutual Savings, Evelyn Cross sat in the passenger seat of her 10-year-old sedan she never drove. Marcus had always driven, and she hadn't touched the wheel since his funeral, and dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. The director of the OCC's Enforcement Division answered on the second ring. Evelyn spoke for exactly 4 minutes. She described the burned check. She described the manager. She described the branch. And then she said the words that every banker dreads. "I'd like to request a full-scope targeted examination, effective immediately." Within 24 hours, a team of 12 OCC auditors had sealed the branch's record room. By noon, they had flagged 17 accounts linked to a decade-long embezzlement scheme, every single one personally approved by Harold Voss. and by the time the FBI placed him in handcuffs on the marble lobby floor the following morning, the man who burned a black woman's check still hadn't spoken a single coherent word, because he had finally understood what the entire branch was about to learn. Evelyn Cross didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to open a file. But what Evelyn Cross uncovered in the next 24 hours didn't just end Harold Voss's career. It peeled back the curtain on a fraud that had been quietly devouring the life savings of working people in that community for nearly a decade. The morning after Evelyn's phone call, a team of 12 OCC auditors arrived at First Mutual Savings at 7 a.m. They didn't announce themselves. They walked in with federal credentials and sealed the record room before the branch even opened for business. The tellers arrived to find their computers locked, their filing cabinets secured with evidence tape, and a woman in a navy blazer calmly photographing every document on Harold Voss's desk. He hadn't arrived yet. When he walked through the door 20 minutes later, 2 FBI agents were waiting in the lobby. He didn't even make it to his office. The auditors started with the 17 accounts that Evelyn had flagged from the parking lot based on pattern memory alone. She didn't have the records in front of her. She just knew the account numbers. She'd seen them over the years on routine visits, noticed the peculiar transaction rhythms, the small withdrawals that looked like nothing individually but together painted a picture. She had never acted on them before because she hadn't had cause to request an examination of a single branch without a trigger event. The burned check was the trigger. Now those 17 accounts sat open on a conference table under fluorescent light, and what the auditors found made 2 of them stop and call their supervisor. Every account belonged to a depositor over the age of 70. Every account showed a pattern of small monthly withdrawals, $50, $75, $120, moving into a series of holding accounts that had been opened under names that didn't match any real customer in the system. The names were variations of deceased account holders, former customers who had passed away years earlier but whose profiles had never been deleted from the internal database. Harold had been using dead people's credentials to move money. One of those accounts belonged to a woman named Frances Dumont. She was 86 years old and had been banking at First Mutual since the branch opened in 1972. She lived in a small house 3 blocks from the bank, the same house she'd bought with her husband after the war. She had been losing small amounts for 6 years and hadn't noticed because the withdrawals were always less than $100, and she trusted her bank. She trusted Harold Voss, who had personally called her on her birthday for the last 4 years to wish her well. When the auditors contacted her and explained that approximately $9,000 had been siphoned from her savings, she sat down at her kitchen table and didn't speak for a full minute. Then she said, "He sent me a Christmas card." Not angry, just hollow, the particular tone of someone who has just learned that kindness they believed in was a weapon. But Frances Dumont's $9,000 was a small piece of a much larger puzzle. As the auditors dug deeper, they discovered that the 17 accounts were just the visible surface. Beneath them sat a hidden structure of 43 additional accounts that Harold had been using to layer transactions, moving funds through a chain of dormant accounts, until the money became virtually untraceable to anyone without a federal forensics team. The total wasn't $2 million. It was closer to $4.7 million, and it had been running through this single branch for at minimum 11 years. The scheme had begun almost the month Harold Voss was promoted to branch manager. And here's the thing that made the OCC auditors sit up straight. Harold couldn't have done this alone. To open and manage 60 separate accounts without triggering internal audits or automated alerts required someone with access to override the bank's compliance software. It required a second person, or more likely multiple people, inside the branch or at the regional level who had been systematically disabling red flags. By the end of the first day, the investigation had expanded from 1 branch manager to include the regional compliance officer and 2 IT administrators who had received suspiciously large bonuses for 5 consecutive years, despite the branch's modest performance metrics. The rot went up the ladder, and Evelyn Cross had just given the OCC the latter. But even that wasn't the discovery that would turn this case into a national story. The pivot came on day 3, when an auditor noticed something in the mortgage portfolio. Harold Voss had been skimming cash from depositors, yes, but he had also been systematically approving predatory home loans to black applicants at rates 2 and 3 points higher than white applicants with identical financial profiles. The higher interest loans generated higher commissions, which flowed back into the branch's bonus pool, which had been partially siphoned into the embezzlement scheme. The fraud wasn't just theft. It was a self-feeding cycle of discrimination and embezzlement that had been operating in plain sight for more than a decade, protected by the people who were supposed to be watching for exactly this kind of abuse. And when the auditors cross-referenced the loan files with the dormant accounts, they found that 6 of the victims whose savings had been drained were the same elderly black homeowners who had been persuaded by Harold to refinance their paid-off homes into predatory loans they couldn't afford. He had stolen their savings and then stolen their houses, all while sending them birthday cards. Evelyn Cross received the preliminary findings by secure email at 9 o'clock that night. She read them on her phone in the living room, sitting in the same chair where Marcus used to grade papers. When she finished, she set the phone down, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. She didn't cry. She didn't call anyone. She just stood at the sink for a long time, looking out the window at the dark, and then she picked up the phone and called the OCC director back. "I want to audit every single account Harold Voss ever touched," she said. "Every transaction, every loan, every signature. And I want the names of every person at the regional level who signed off on his compliance reports." The director was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Evelyn, if we open that door, we're going to find the entire regional structure. You understand what that means?" Evelyn's voice didn't waver. "I understand that my husband died with 31 years of teaching and a life insurance policy he paid into for 3 decades. And a man in a cheap suit tried to tell me that check wasn't real because of the color of my skin. Open the door." The door opened, and what was waiting on the other side would shake the banking industry to its foundations. Within 72 hours, the OCC had expanded the investigation to the entire regional chain, 6 branches across 3 counties. The auditors had been working in rotating shifts with the lights on at the federal building downtown, and what they were pulling out of the servers was not a series of isolated crimes. It was a coordinated architecture of theft that had been operational since 2008. The regional compliance officer was a man named Gerald Prentice. He was 63 years old, 6 months from retirement with a fully vested pension. He had been signing off on Harold Voss's branch audits for 9 years without flagging a single irregularity. When the investigators finally obtained his internal email records, they found the reason. Gerald Prentice had been skimming from a parallel system of accounts in 4 other branches using the exact same method: dormant profiles, small withdrawals, layered transfers. He and Harold had not been working together in the traditional sense. They had simply recognized, through the silent language of unchecked ledgers, that they were doing the same thing, and neither one had any incentive to ask questions about the other. A quiet, parasitic symbiosis operating entirely in the blind spots of the bank's internal controls. But the moment the story truly broke open came when a junior teller named Carla Reyes walked into the OCC field office on day 4 and asked to speak with someone. Carla was 24 years old, had worked at First Mutual for 3 years, and had been sitting on something since her 2nd month on the job. She had noticed a discrepancy in an elderly woman's account, a $75 withdrawal that the customer, a woman named Mrs. Leona Birch, had come in to dispute. Carla had escalated it to Harold Voss per protocol. He had smiled, thanked her for her diligence, and told her he would handle it personally. The next day, Carla was moved from the customer service desk to the back office filing room. The day after that, her direct deposit had been quietly increased by $50 a paycheck. She had never asked for it. She had never been told why. She had understood, in the way young employees in precarious positions sometimes understand, that the money was not a reward. It was a leash. and for 3 years she had worn it because she was afraid of what would happen if she took it off. Carla brought with her a folder of handwritten notes she had kept hidden in her apartment, dates, account numbers, times she had heard Harold on the phone with someone she now believed was Gerald Prentice. She also brought the name of a third person, the bank's third-party IT contractor, a company called Veridian Systems, which had been paid to maintain the security software that was supposed to catch exactly the kind of transaction patterns Harold and Gerald were running. Veridian Systems, it turned out, was owned by Gerald Prentice's brother-in-law. The software wasn't just failing to catch the fraud. It had been configured to generate false audit logs showing that the flagged accounts were being reviewed every quarter. The logs were fiction, pure, manufactured fiction, generated automatically by a patch that had been written by a developer who had been paid off with a cut of the dormant account proceeds. When the FBI served the warrant at the Veridian Systems office in a suburban business park, they found a backup server in a locked closet that contained the real audit logs, the ones that had been suppressed. Those logs showed that the bank's automated fraud detection system had, in fact, flagged the 17 accounts 6 different times over the previous 5 years. Each time, the alert had been manually overridden. Each override bore Gerald Prentice's digital signature. Harold Voss had been the hand that took the money. Gerald Prentice had been the architect who made the alarms go silent. Now, you'd think at this point that the story was a straightforward case of corporate fraud, a few bad apples, an internal cover-up, a federal investigation. And that would have been enough. But the investigation hit a vein that went far beyond one bank or one region. When the OCC began cross-referencing the settlement records from the predatory mortgage scheme with the demographic data of the surrounding neighborhoods, the numbers told a story that made the embezzlement look small. Over a 10-year period, First Mutual Savings and its parent holding company had approved home loans to black applicants at an average interest rate of 9.2%. White applicants with the same credit scores, same income levels, same loan amounts had received an average rate of 5.6%. The difference, compounded over 30-year mortgages, had drained an estimated $47 million from black homeowners in that community alone. Some of those same homeowners were the ones whose dormant accounts had been raided because they had stopped checking them, not out of negligence, but because they had been pushed out of their homes. The Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice opened a parallel investigation 3 weeks after Evelyn's phone call. The bank's parent company, a mid-sized regional holding group called Commonwealth Financial, immediately issued a statement that this was the work of a few isolated individuals and that they were cooperating fully. But the emails told a different story. Internal communications from 5 years earlier showed that the regional vice president had personally reviewed a loan officer training manual that included a section on what it called neighborhood risk profiling, a coded way of steering black loan applicants toward higher-rate products regardless of qualification. The VP had approved the manual with a single handwritten note in the margin. Good. Keep it quiet. By the time this all came to light, Evelyn Cross had become something she never intended to be, a public figure. She had not sought the spotlight. She had made one phone call from a parking lot. But the story of the black woman who had been laughed at and dismissed and then had dismantled a fraud empire with a single call had spread from local news to national outlets in a matter of days. And the bank, sensing the public relations catastrophe, did what institutions often do when they are losing the story. They tried to discredit the messenger. A public relations firm hired by Commonwealth Financial floated a series of anonymous op-eds in local papers questioning Evelyn's qualifications, suggesting she had been a disgruntled customer with a personal vendetta. One outlet ran a piece implying that the check might not have been legitimate after all, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. They dug into her late husband's teaching record, looking for any blemish they could amplify. They found none. Marcus Cross had been a beloved educator with a spotless career, so they pivoted to Evelyn's record at the OCC, trying to frame her as a rogue agent with a history of overreach. That backfired spectacularly when the former OCC director, a man named Alan Hennessy, now retired, went on television and said on the record, "Evelyn Cross is the finest examiner I ever trained. If she opened an investigation, you can take everything she found to the bank, pun intended, and the only question left is how much deeper it goes." It went deeper. On day 11, a whistleblower from Commonwealth Financial's internal audit department came forward with documents showing that the board of directors had been briefed on irregular patterns at the First Mutual branch 3 separate times over the previous 4 years. Each time, the briefing had been tabled, not dismissed, tabled. A decision had been made at the highest levels not to look. The reasoning, preserved in meeting minutes, was that a full investigation might trigger regulatory scrutiny that would hurt the pending merger with a larger bank out of Atlanta. The merger was going to generate $40 million in executive bonuses, and the lives of people like Francis Dumont and Leona Birch were not worth more than $40 million to the people in that boardroom. Evelyn Cross saw the board minutes on a Tuesday morning, forwarded to her by one of the investigators who had kept her in the loop as a courtesy to the woman who had cracked the case open. She read them at her kitchen table, the same table where Marcus had graded his last set of papers. And she did something she had not done since the day she walked out of that bank. She allowed herself to cry, not from sadness, from fury. A lifetime spent protecting the integrity of a system, and the system had been hollowed out by the very people who ran it, who had decided that what looked like integrity on paper was worth more than the integrity of actual lives. She dried her eyes. She stood up. She called the lead federal prosecutor and asked a single question: "When can I testify?" The public hearing was scheduled for the following month. But the bank, bleeding depositors and facing a shareholder revolt, didn't wait for the hearing. The board voted to terminate the CEO and the entire executive compensation committee. The merger collapsed. The DOJ announced criminal charges against 11 individuals, including Harold Voss, Gerald Prentice, 2 Veridian developers, and 3 senior executives at Commonwealth Financial. The case became the largest bank fraud prosecution in the state's history. And yet, for all the indictments and the headlines and the policy reforms, the truest measure of what Evelyn Cross had done did not live in a courtroom. It lived in the living room of Francis Dumont, who received her $9,000 back plus restitution, and who, for the first time in 6 years, could afford to replace the furnace in her house without fear. It lived in the phone call from Carla Reyes, who quit her job at the bank and enrolled in community college to study forensic accounting, and who called Evelyn to say thank you, not for the investigation, but for showing her that the leash could be cut. It lived in the quiet knowledge that an entire regional banking structure had been rebuilt from the ground up, with new oversight, new compliance systems, and a new understanding that the people who protected the system were often more dangerous than the people who wanted to rob it. The room had changed, and one woman with one phone call and a lifetime of knowing what to look for had been the reason. The criminal trial of Harold Voss, Gerald Prentice, and the 3 Commonwealth Financial executives began 14 months after Evelyn Cross watched her husband's check burn in a wastebasket. The federal courthouse was packed every day, not just with journalists, but with people from the neighborhoods around First Mutual Savings, elderly depositors who had lost money, homeowners who had been steered into predatory loans, former employees who had been silenced. They filled the gallery in shifts. Some brought photographs of homes they had lost. One woman, Leona Birch, wore the same dress to court every single day. When a reporter asked her why, she said, "Because I bought this dress with the first withdrawal he stole from me. I want him to see it every time he looks up." Harold Voss did not look up often. He sat at the defense table in a suit that no longer fit him well, his posture collapsed inward, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The swagger that had carried him through 11 years of theft was gone, replaced by the hollow stillness of a man who has finally understood that the system he spent a decade gaming had been waiting for one person with the right key. That key was Evelyn Cross. She testified on day 3. Direct, precise, unshakable. The defense attorney tried to challenge her findings. He cited her retirement, suggested her memory might be faulty, implied that the whole investigation had been a personal vendetta. Evelyn listened to each question without reaction, then answered with the calm of a woman who had trained 3 generations of federal examiners and had forgotten more about forensic accounting than the defense attorney would ever learn. At the end of cross-examination, she turned to the jury and said, "I didn't do this for revenge. I did it because my husband taught me that silence in the face of wrong is its own kind of permission. I had been silent long enough." The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts, but the verdict was only the beginning of the reckoning. Commonwealth Financial, facing a class action lawsuit from over 400 affected customers and a DOJ consent order that gave federal regulators direct oversight of its operations, agreed to a restitution fund of $112 million, the largest civil settlement in the state's banking history. Every depositor who had been defrauded received a full accounting and full repayment plus interest. The predatory mortgage holders had their loans recalculated at fair market rates, with the difference refunded and their credit histories repaired. The settlement also mandated a complete overhaul of the bank's compliance infrastructure, including the termination of Veridian systems, the installation of an independent monitoring firm, and the creation of a new executive role, Chief Ethics Officer, that reported directly to the board. Commonwealth Financial's stock price never recovered. 2 years later, the bank was acquired by a credit union consortium that had no interest in preserving the old name. First Mutual Savings was scrubbed from every sign, every awning, every piece of correspondence. The branch where Harold Voss had burned a widow's check was converted into a community financial literacy center, funded by the restitution settlement, and staffed by former OCC examiners who trained local residents to read the fine print, spot predatory terms, and file complaints with the regulatory agencies that had once been too distant to help. Carla Reyes, the teller who had turned over her handwritten notes, graduated from community college with a degree in forensic accounting and was hired by the OCC as a field examiner trainee. Her first assignment, at her own request, was to join the ongoing audit of Commonwealth Financial's former regional offices. The supervisor who approved the assignment was the same investigator who had taken her statement in the field office on day 4. He wrote one line in the approval memo: "She's already proven she knows what to look for." Gerald Prentice was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. He lost his pension. His brother-in-law's company, Veridian Systems, was dissolved and its assets seized. The developer who had written the patch that generated false audit logs cooperated with prosecutors and received a reduced sentence. He later testified before a congressional subcommittee about the ease with which internal compliance software could be weaponized against the people it was designed to protect, and his testimony contributed to a new federal standard for third-party audit system certification. Harold Voss received 14 years. At his sentencing hearing, the judge asked if he had anything to say. He stood, turned toward the gallery where Evelyn Cross was sitting in the second row, and opened his mouth. No words came. He stood there for 6 full seconds, his mouth working around a silence that had no exit. Then he closed it, sat down, and did not speak again. The man who had laughed and called her sweetheart and lit a match to her husband's death benefit now could not form a single sentence in her presence. The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. But the surprising detail, the thing that even the OCC investigators didn't know until the final audit report was published 2 years later, was this: Evelyn Cross had not just uncovered the embezzlement at First Mutual Savings. The pattern analysis she had requested from the parking lot, applied at scale to the entire Commonwealth Financial network, had revealed a web of similar schemes operating in 14 other branches across 5 states, all using variations of the same dormant account layering technique. The investigation she triggered ultimately led to the recovery of over $300 million in stolen funds and the criminal prosecution of 37 additional individuals across the regional banking sector. One phone call, one burned check, one woman who refused to be dismissed, and the entire architecture of fraud that had been hiding in plain sight for more than a decade came apart at the seams. Evelyn never sought a reward. When the DOJ offered her a whistleblower share of the recovered assets, she declined. She asked only that a portion of the settlement be used to fund financial literacy programs in the communities that had been targeted. The fund, named the Marcus Cross Memorial Trust for Financial Education, still operates today, teaching homeowners and small savers how to protect what they've built. The trust's logo is a small, simple image, a check, unburned with a single flame beneath it that never touches the paper. The flame that never touches the paper. That's the thing about people like Evelyn Cross. The world sees a quiet widow in an old sedan, a woman who can be dismissed with a laugh and a lighter. They never see the decades of expertise, the phone numbers saved for exactly the right moment, the quiet preparation that turns a single act of defiance into a systemic reckoning. Every day, in branches and offices and courtrooms across the country, someone is underestimating the wrong person. Someone is laughing at a check they don't understand, dismissing a voice before it speaks, burning paper and assuming the fire won't spread. What they never consider is that the person standing in front of them might have spent a lifetime learning exactly how the system works and exactly where to strike. Have you ever been dismissed? Told your qualifications didn't matter, your check wasn't real, your voice wasn't ready? Or have you watched it happen to someone else? Drop your story in the comments. I read every single one, because these moments are not isolated. They connect, they echo, and they remind us that the people we underestimate are often the ones holding the matches not to burn, but to light the way. If this story moved something in you tonight, send it to one person who needs to know that being underestimated doesn't mean being powerless. And if you're not subscribed yet, stay close. There's another story coming next week about someone who was told they didn't belong and proved them all wrong. Until then, may the truth always find the right check at the right time.